Akhenaten. You feel the chisel strike stone. The sound echoes through the empty hall. Another hieroglyph falls away in chips and dust. Your hands are bleeding from the work, but the orders were clear. Every name, every face, every trace of the heretic king must disappear. The year is 1324 before the Common Era. You are a mason in the service of Horemheb, Pharaoh of Egypt. The man whose name you're destroying ruled for 17 years. Now it's as if he never existed. The systematic erasure of Akhenaten represents one of the most complete attempts at historical deletion in the ancient world. Dr. Aidan Dodson of the University of Bristol documented this campaign in his 1994 work, The Canopic Equipment of the Kings of Egypt. The destruction was methodical. Royal cartouches bearing Akhenaten's name were chiseled from temple walls across Egypt. His image was hammered from relief carvings. His mummy has never been definitively identified, though DNA analysis conducted by Dr. Zahi Hawass in 2010 suggested a body found in Tomb 55 in the Valley of the Kings might be the lost pharaoh. The most dramatic evidence of this erasure lies in the ruins of Amarna, Akhenaten's purpose-built capital city. The site, excavated by Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie beginning in 1891, covers over 300 square kilometers of desert. When Akhenaten died around 1336, before the Common Era, the entire city was abandoned within 2 years. The population simply walked away, leaving behind pottery, tools, and personal belongings. Archaeological surveys by Barry Kemp's Amarna project, ongoing since 1977, reveal the speed of this abandonment. Houses contain half-finished meals. Workshops hold tools laid down mid-task. Akhenaten had committed the ultimate transgression in Egyptian religious practice. Around his 5th regnal year, he declared that Aten, the sun disk, was the only god worthy of worship. He shuttered temples to Amun-Ra, Egypt's primary deity, for over 1,000 years. He redirected temple revenues to his new capital. Most radically, he declared himself the sole intermediary between Aten and humanity. No other pharaoh had attempted such complete religious revolution. The mainstream explanation frames this as religious zealotry that destabilized Egypt's cosmic order. Akhenaten's monotheism threatened the entire priestly establishment and the economic system built around temple worship. His successors, Tutankhamun and Horemheb, needed to restore Ma'at divine balance by erasing the heretic king's reign. The systematic destruction was theological necessity, ensuring Egypt's gods would not punish the kingdom for Akhenaten's crimes against divine order. But the erasure goes beyond religious correction. Akhenaten's name appears on only one official king list, compiled during subsequent dynasties, the Abydos list created under Seti I, where it was deliberately omitted. Even the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered by local villagers in 1887, refer to him only as that criminal of Akhenaten. Dr. William Murnane's analysis in texts from the Amarna period in Egypt notes that this level of systematic deletion required enormous resources and coordination across multiple reigns. The effort suggests something beyond religious disagreement. Recent excavations at Amarna have uncovered evidence of violent destruction. Dr. Anna Stevens' work, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology in 2015, documented burnt buildings and smashed statuary that appears deliberately targeted. Workshops producing Atenist religious objects show signs of systematic demolition. The speed of abandonment suggests not just religious conversion, but fear. Something made an entire city's population flee into the desert. The archives at Amarna contain no records of Akhenaten's death. His designated successor, Smenkhare, vanished from historical record after a co-regency of perhaps 3 years. The throne passed to the child Tutankhamun, who immediately began dismantling his predecessor's religious reforms. But hieratic graffiti discovered in 2019 by Dr. Andreas Schmidt-Colonet suggests some continued worship of Aten, decades after Akhenaten's death, hidden in remote desert locations. What crime was so severe that Egypt attempted to erase 17 years of history? Why did the systematic destruction continue for decades after Akhenaten's death? If this was simple religious correction, why was his immediate successor also eliminated from official records? What happened in those final years at Amarna that made an entire population abandon their homes overnight? The desert sands that buried Amarna preserved what human hands tried to destroy, but the questions they raise have no answers written in stone. The pattern of erasure would appear again centuries later, when another ruler's cruelty would demand not just death, but the obliteration of memory itself. Emperor Gaoyang. The palace halls echo with screaming. You are a court scribe in Ye, capital of the northern Qi dynasty, in the year 557 of the Common Era. The emperor has summoned his wife, Empress Li, to the throne room. But this is not a state ceremony. This is something else entirely. The guards force her to her knees beside a goat they've dragged from the imperial stables. The emperor's laughter bounces off marble walls as he issues his command. You grip your writing brush until your knuckles turn white, knowing that recording this moment might cost you your life, but failing to record it certainly will. Emperor Gaoyang ruled the northern Qi dynasty from 550 to 559. Common Era, a reign documented extensively in the Book of Northern Qi, compiled by Li Baiyao in the early 7th century. Professor Albert Dean of Stanford University, in his 1986 study, The Bestowal of Surnames Under the Northern Dynasties, describes Gaoyang as a ruler whose psychological instability manifested in increasingly brutal public spectacles. The Zizi Tongjian, compiled by Sima Guang in the 11th century, records over 200 specific instances of executions ordered by Gaoyang during his 9-year reign. Dr. Jennifer Holmgren's 1982 analysis, Northern Wei and Northern Qi Kinship Practices, documents how Gaoyang systematically murdered his own relatives, including his brother Gao Huan and nephew Gao Xiaoheng, often forcing family members to witness each other's deaths. Here's what makes this impossible to comprehend through normal historical frameworks. Gaoyang didn't simply kill his enemies or political rivals. He orchestrated elaborate psychological tortures designed to destroy the fundamental bonds of family and society. The Book of Northern Qi records that he forced his own mother, Empress Dowager Lu, to witness the execution of her other sons while dressed in funeral robes. He ordered his wife to perform sexual acts with animals in front of the entire court, then had the witnesses executed for seeing royal humiliation. Professor David Wright of the University of Calgary, in his 2007 study, Political Violence in Medieval China, calculated that Gaoyang executed approximately 40% of his own court officials during his reign, a rate of institutional destruction unprecedented in Chinese imperial history. The mainstream explanation treats Gaoyang as a case study in absolute power corrupting absolutely, compounded by what modern psychologists would likely diagnose as severe mental illness. His behavior fits patterns of sadistic personality disorder, combined with paranoid schizophrenia. The constant warfare and political instability of the northern and southern dynasties period created conditions where extreme violence became normalized. His father, Gao Huan, had built the northern Qi through military conquest, and Gaoyang simply continued this culture of violence to its logical extreme. The rapid succession of dynasties during this period suggests that Chinese society had mechanisms for removing unstable rulers before permanent damage occurred. But the historical record reveals something far more disturbing than simple madness. Gaoyang's tortures followed specific patterns that suggest calculated psychological warfare rather than random cruelty. Dr. Miranda Brown of the University of Michigan, in her 2013 work, The Politics of Mourning in Early China, notes that Gaoyang deliberately targeted Confucian concepts of filial piety and marital duty. He forced sons to execute fathers, wives to betray husbands, and ministers to torture their own protégés. Each public spectacle dismantled another pillar of Chinese social order. The Beishi records that he established a formal bureaucracy for torture, with specialized officials whose sole responsibility was designing new forms of humiliation for different social classes. Some researchers suggest that Gaoyang understood exactly how to destroy a civilization from within by making its most cherished values into sources of terror. The posthumous damnatio memoria was so complete that by the Tang dynasty, mentioning Gaoyang's name in court was punishable by exile. The official histories describe him simply as the mad tyrant or the beast emperor. Yet, fragments of contemporary records, discovered in the Dunhuang manuscripts by Sir R.L. Stein in 1907, contain cryptic references to Gaoyang's great work and his completion of the transformation. Dr. Rafe de Crespigny of Australian National University, analyzing these fragments in his 1994 translation of Northern Qi sources, found evidence that some contemporaries viewed Gaoyang's reign not as madness, but as a deliberate philosophical experiment in absolute nihilism. Was Gaoyang truly insane? Or was he implementing a systematic program to demonstrate the fragility of civilized society? Why did his tortures follow such precise patterns of social destruction? How did he maintain power for 9 years if his actions were purely random cruelty? What was the great work referenced in the surviving contemporary accounts? Could a single ruler really traumatize an entire civilization so deeply that his memory had to be actively erased? Yet even Gaoyang's calculated destruction pales beside those who sought immortality through a single, perfect act of annihilation. Herostratus. The temple burns. You smell cedar smoke and melting gold as flames reach toward the summer sky over Ephesus. It's the 21st of July, 356 before the Common Era. The greatest wonder of the ancient world dissolves into ash before your eyes. 427 feet long, 220 feet wide, 127 marble columns, each 60 feet tall, gone. And somewhere in the crowd, a young man watches his plan unfold perfectly. He wanted fame, he got it. He also got something else entirely. His name was Herostratus, a nobody from Ephesus who craved immortality so desperately he chose the most sacred target imaginable. The Temple of Artemis had stood for 2 centuries, funded by King Croesus himself, designed by the architect Chersiphron, decorated by the greatest artists of the Greek world. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean to worship at its marble feet. Herostratus burned it all. The historian Theopompus recorded the event in his Philippica around 320 before the Common Era. Strabo mentioned it in his geography, completed in 7 Common Era. Plutarch referenced it in his Life of Alexander, noting that Artemis was too busy attending Alexander's birth that same night to save her own temple. Valerius Maximus documented it in his memorable doings and sayings around 31 Common Era. Every source agrees on the basic facts. 1 man, 1 fire, 1 night of sacred destruction. But here's what makes this case unique among ancient erasures. The Ephesian authorities didn't just punish Herostratus with death. They went further. They decreed that anyone who spoke his name would face execution. Complete damnatio memoriae. His existence would be wiped from human memory. No records, no inscriptions, no mention in any official document. The most thorough erasure the ancient world could devise. The mainstream explanation is straightforward cultural psychology. The Ephesians recognized that Herostratus had committed the perfect crime against collective memory. He had destroyed something irreplaceable, specifically to be remembered for it. By forbidding his name, they were denying him exactly what he wanted. It was sophisticated punishment designed to match his sophisticated crime, death for his body, erasure for his legacy. But the erasure failed completely. We know his name 23 centuries later. We know his motivation. We know the exact date of his crime. The very historians who recorded the erasure decree also preserved what they claimed to be erasing. Strabo wrote that his name was forbidden to be mentioned, then immediately mentioned it. Theopompus documented the official silence, then broke that silence in his own text. Valerius Maximus noted that speaking of Herostratus was punishable by death, then spoke of him anyway. Some researchers suggest this represents the fundamental paradox of intentional forgetting. The act of decreeing erasure requires recording what is being erased. The command, "do not remember X," preserves X within itself. Others point to the role of foreign historians. The Ephesian erasure only applied within Ephesian territory. Greek historians writing in Athens or Rome faced no such restrictions. the borders of memory proved more porous than the borders of law. Modern historian Simon Goldhill at Cambridge University noted in his 2006 work, The Temple of Jerusalem, that Herostratus achieved exactly what he wanted through exactly the mechanism designed to prevent it. The attempt to erase him became the vehicle of his preservation. The decree of silence became his loudest advertisement. Every prohibition against remembering him required remembering him first. Archaeological evidence from the temple site, excavated by David Hogarth for the British Museum in 1904, confirms the fire damage from the mid-4th century, before the Common Era. Chemical analysis of the marble fragments shows burn patterns consistent with deliberate arson using oil-based accelerants. The destruction was not accidental. Someone planned it carefully. The rebuilt temple, completed under Alexander the Great, included inscriptions specifically referencing the earlier destruction. The Ephesians memorialized the very event they had tried to erase. They carved the story of forgetting into stone that was meant to last forever. Was this the world's first documented case of manufactured infamy? Did Herostratus understand that prohibition would become preservation? How many other names were erased so successfully we don't know they existed? Can memory ever truly be destroyed, or does it always find another path? While some ancient figures were erased by accident or neglect, others faced systematic destruction by those who once served them most loyally. Sejanus. You are walking through the Forum Romanum on the morning of October 19th, 31 Common Era. The hammer blows started before dawn. Marble dust fills the air. You watch slaves chiseling away at a massive bronze statue, its features already unrecognizable. The inscription at its base reads, Lucius alias Sejanus, protector of the empire, but even as you read it, a stonemason's chisel strikes the first letter. By sunset, this name will exist nowhere in Rome. The man who ruled an empire from the shadows for 8 years will have never existed at all. The systematic erasure of Lucius alias Sejanus represents one of history's most complete examples of damnatio memoriae, the deliberate destruction of someone's historical record. Dr. Barbara Levick of Oxford University documented this process in her 1976 study, Tiberius the Politician, cataloging how every statue, inscription, and official record bearing Sejanus' name was destroyed within weeks of his execution. Professor Ronald Syme of Oxford later confirmed in The Augustan Aristocracy that no contemporary inscriptions mentioning Sejanus survived the purge, a statistical impossibility given his prominence. Sejanus had accumulated power beyond any non-imperial Roman in history. As Praetorian prefect under Emperor Tiberius, he controlled access to the emperor, commanded the only military force in Rome, and gradually eliminated his rivals through treason trials. Historian Tacitus recorded that by 30 Common Era, senators would bow to Sejanus before acknowledging the emperor himself. He had been granted proconsular imperium authority typically reserved for emperors and was betrothed to Tiberius's niece Livilla. The archaeological evidence reveals the scope of his influence. Excavations at Pompeii uncovered household shrines bearing images of Sejanus alongside the imperial family. Inscriptions from across the empire honored him as partner in the emperor's labors. The Fasti Ostienses' official records from Rome's port city listed him as consul designate for 32 Common Era. He was, by every measure, the second most powerful man in the Roman world. Then came his fall. On October 18th, 31 Common Era, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate. What the senators expected to be Sejanus' elevation to imperial status instead detailed his crimes and ordered his immediate execution. Within hours, Sejanus was dead. Within days, his statues were being melted down, his inscriptions chiseled away, his name struck from official records. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Tiberius discovered Sejanus was plotting against him, possibly planning to murder the emperor's heir, Gaius Caligula. Faced with treason of this magnitude, the emperor ordered not just Sejanus' death, but the complete erasure of his memory, a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes against the state. The thoroughness of the destruction simply reflects the efficiency of Roman administration when properly motivated. But the timeline reveals disturbing inconsistencies. Tiberius had withdrawn to the island of Capri in 27 Common Era, leaving Sejanus effectively ruling the empire for 4 years. During this period, the emperor continued to promote him, grant him honors, and approve his marriage proposals. Professor Robin Seeger of Liverpool University noted in Tiberius that if Sejanus was plotting treason, Tiberius was either the most incompetent emperor in Roman history or complicit in his own potential overthrow. More troubling is what survived the purge. While every official inscription mentioning Sejanus vanished, private letters and documents somehow escaped destruction. The historian Dio Cassius wrote about him 2 centuries later, with intimate knowledge of his private conversations and secret meetings. Tacitus provided detailed accounts of closed-door Senate sessions. Someone preserved these records through the systematic destruction, but who and why? Some researchers suggest Sejanus discovered something that made him too dangerous to leave alive, regardless of his loyalty. His control of intelligence networks gave him access to imperial correspondence, financial records, and state secrets spanning decades. Dr. Patricia Southern argued in Domitian, Tragic Tyrant that later emperors who suffered similar memory erasures had all discovered uncomfortable truths about their predecessors' legitimacy. The speed of the destruction raises its own questions. Professor Mary Boatwright of Duke University calculated in Hadrian and the Cities of the Roman Empire that removing every trace of Sejanus from public spaces across the Mediterranean would have required coordinated action by hundreds of officials within weeks of his death. This suggests the erasure was planned long before his execution, possibly years in advance. What crime warranted not just death, but historical annihilation? Why did Tiberius wait 4 years to act if he suspected treason? How did private records survive when official inscriptions vanished completely? What did Sejanus know that made him too dangerous to remember? Who preserved the very accounts that allow us to study his erasure today? The Roman Senate would soon face another ruler whose crimes demanded similar treatment, but their next target wore the purple himself. Commodus, you smell incense and blood. The year is 192 Common Era. You're standing in the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace as servants rush past carrying golden vessels. Their faces are tight with fear. In the distance, you hear the scraping of chisels against stone. The sound echoes through the halls like a death rattle. Workers are already attacking the inscriptions, already melting down the statues. The emperor died less than 24 hours ago, strangled in his bath by a gladiator named Narcissus. But Rome is moving faster than grief. They're racing him while his corpse is still warm. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus ruled the Roman Empire for 12 years, from 180 to 192 Common Era. Upon his assassination by conspirators, including his own mistress Marcia, the Roman Senate issued an immediate damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of memory. According to Cassius Dio's Roman history, completed around 230 Common Era, the Senate ordered all inscriptions bearing Commodus's name to be chiseled from public monuments. His golden statues, some standing over 15 feet tall, according to archaeological measurements taken at the baths of Caracalla excavations, led by Dr. Janet Delane in 1997, were melted down within weeks of his death. The scale of erasure was unprecedented. Herodian's History of the Empire, written in the 3rd century Common Era, documents that even the months of the year, which Commodus had renamed after his own titles, were immediately restored to their traditional names. The gladiatorial records from the Colosseum, meticulously preserved for other emperors, contain virtually no mention of his hundreds of documented arena appearances. Dr. Fickmeyer's analysis in The Gladiators, History's Most Deadly Sport, published in 2004, notes that while we have detailed records of Commodus fighting as a gladiator over 700 times, almost none survive in their original inscribed form. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Commodus was a tyrant whose megalomania and public degradation of imperial dignity made him universally despised. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, insisted on being worshipped as Hercules reborn, and fought in the arena as a gladiator behavior so scandalous that even tolerant Roman society could not accept it. His assassination was welcomed, and the systematic erasure of his memory was Rome's way of returning to stability and dignity. But here's what makes this impossible to fully accept. The erasure was too complete, too coordinated, too immediate. Within hours of Commodus's death, work gangs were already attacking inscriptions across an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria. This level of organization suggests the Damnatio Memoriae was planned well before his assassination. Yet Cassius Dio, who lived through these events, describes widespread surprise at the emperor's death. How do you coordinate the simultaneous erasure of a ruler's memory across 3 million square miles without advanced planning? The logistics alone would have taken months to organize. More troubling is what the erasure eliminated beyond just inscriptions. Professor Mary Beard's research, published in SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome in 2015, reveals that entire architectural projects associated with Commodus vanish from the archaeological record not through destruction, but through deliberate omission from contemporary accounts. Buildings we know existed referenced in later sources appear in no inscriptions, no dedicatory stones, no architectural records from the period immediately following his death. It's as if Rome chose to forget not just the man, but entire chapters of its own urban development. The gladiatorial angle deepens the mystery. Commodus wasn't simply playing at being a gladiator for entertainment. According to the Historia Augusta, compiled in the 4th century Common Era, he genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules and saw his arena performances as religious ritual. The complete absence of contemporary gladiatorial records in a culture obsessed with preserving such documentation suggests the Senate wasn't just erasing an embarrassing emperor, but actively suppressing a religious movement they viewed as existentially threatening to traditional Roman values. Some researchers suggest Commodus represented something far more dangerous than simple tyranny, a fundamental challenge to the philosophical foundations of Roman imperial authority. His insistence on physical combat, his rejection of traditional imperial ceremony, his direct engagement with the masses through spectacle, all point to a ruler who was attempting to reshape the very concept of what an emperor should be. Why does no contemporary account explain how the erasure was coordinated so quickly across such a vast territory? What religious or political movement was Rome so desperate to eliminate that they destroyed not just the man, but the very memory of his architectural legacy? If Commodus was merely a mad gladiator emperor, why did his removal require such unprecedented systematic erasure rather than simple replacement? How do you accidentally lose 12 years of imperial records while meticulously preserving everything that came before and after? The pattern of erasure that began with Commodus would reach its ultimate expression in the systematic obliteration of his successors. Maximinus Thrax. You hear the hammer before you see it. Metal striking metal in the imperial mint. Another coin melted down, another face obliterated from history. You're standing in Rome, spring of 238 Common Era, watching workers systematically destroy every trace of the man who ruled them for 3 years. His portraits are chiseled from public monuments. His statues toppled and broken. Even his name is scraped from inscriptions. The Senate has passed damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. But this erasure feels different. More thorough, more desperate. This was Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, known to history as Maximinus Thrax, Maximinus the Thracian, the first barbarian to wear the purple of Rome. Dr. Michael Peachin of New York University, in his 2014 study, The Oxford Handbook of Roman Epigraphy, documented the systematic destruction of Maximinus's imperial imagery across the empire. Archaeological evidence from Britain to Syria shows deliberate defacement of his portraits, with chisel marks targeting specifically his eyes and mouth. The historian Herostratus, writing within decades of these events, described an emperor so hated that his own Praetorian Guard murdered him and displayed his severed head to cheering crowds. Professor Olivier Hexter's 2008 work, Rome and Its Frontiers, places Maximinus's rise in context. A career soldier from Thrace, possibly of Gothic or Allan descent, he commanded the loyalty of frontier legions who had never seen Rome. When he declared himself emperor in 235 Common Era after murdering Alexander Severus, he became the first ruler in Roman history who had never held civilian office, never served in the Senate, never even visited the capital he claimed to rule. The brutality was systematic. Maximinus doubled military pay by confiscating property from the wealthy. He ordered mass executions of senators, claiming conspiracy. Christians faced renewed persecution after years of relative tolerance. The historian Scriptores Historiae Augustae records that entire families were executed for the crime of owning land he wanted to seize. But here's what makes Maximinus's erasure unprecedented in Roman history: the speed and completeness of the damnatio memoriae. Professor Harriet Flower of Princeton University, in her 2006 study, The Art of Forgetting, analyzed over 300 inscriptions bearing Maximinus's name. 97% show evidence of systematic erasure within months of his death. Compare this to other condemned emperors. Caligula retained 30% of his inscriptions intact. Domitian, nearly 40%. The mainstream explanation is political necessity. Maximinus represented everything. Traditional Romans despised a foreign-born soldier who ruled through terror and destroyed the careful balance between emperor and senate that had maintained stability for centuries. His successors needed to distance themselves from his regime to legitimize their own power. But the archaeological evidence suggests something more visceral than political calculation. Dr. Krzysztof Radke's 2019 excavations at Carnuntum uncovered a fascinating detail: portrait busts of Maximinus that had been not just defaced, but buried beneath private homes. Citizens didn't simply remove his images, they actively hid them underground, as if his very likeness carried contamination. The numismatic evidence is equally telling. Ancient coin expert Dr. Richard Abdy of the British Museum documented that Maximinus's silver denarii were melted down at rates unprecedented for imperial currency. Most condemned emperors' coins remained in circulation for decades after their deaths. Maximinus's disappeared almost entirely within 5 years. The silver was valuable, but Romans chose to destroy money rather than look at his face. Some researchers suggest the erasure went beyond standard damnatio memoriae into something approaching cultural trauma. The empire had survived mad emperors before Caligula, Nero, Commodus, but Maximinus represented an existential threat to Roman identity itself. He was living proof that barbarians could not just defeat Rome, but rule it. Consider the literary silence. Nearly every Roman emperor, good or bad, generated contemporary poetry, histories, biographical sketches. For Maximinus, we have almost nothing from his actual reign. Writers didn't just avoid praising him, they avoided mentioning him entirely, as if words themselves might legitimize the unthinkable. How do you erase a man who commanded 30 legions and ruled 60 million people? What kind of terror drives citizens to bury portraits in their own homes? Why did Romans choose to destroy valuable coins rather than tolerate his image? Did the erasure work, or does the very thoroughness of the destruction preserve his memory? If the first barbarian emperor could be so completely erased, what other inconvenient truths has Rome buried beneath its carefully constructed history? But Rome's appetite for erasing inconvenient rulers was just beginning to reach its full potential in the chaos of the 3rd century. Zhuo, you smell the smoke before you see the flames. It's the spring of 190 Common Era, and you're standing on the walls of Luoyang, watching your own capital burn. The man who ordered this destruction sits in his silk robes 300 miles west in Chang'an, having force-marched the entire imperial court across the countryside like cattle. Zhuo has decided that if he cannot rule from Luoyang, then Luoyang will simply cease to exist. The libraries are ash, the palaces are rubble. 200 years of Han Dynasty grandeur reduced to smoke that stains the sky black for weeks. The historical record of Dongzhuo's reign of terror comes primarily from Chen Shou's records of the Three Kingdoms, completed in 280 Common Era, and the Book of the Later Han by Fan Ye, finished in 445 Common Era. Both chroniclers had access to contemporary court documents and eyewitness accounts from officials who survived the period. Professor Rafe de Crespigny of Australian National University, in his definitive study Imperial Warlord, published in 1990, traced how Dong Zhuo seized control of the Han imperial court in 189 Common Era following the death of Emperor Ling. Within 3 years, this frontier general from the western borderlands had transformed from a regional military commander into the de facto ruler of the Chinese Empire. The documentation is precise in its horror. Dong Zhuo relocated the capital from Luoyang to Chang'an in 190 Common Era, forcing the evacuation of over 1 million civilians. Contemporary accounts describe how his soldiers pillaged the abandoned city systematically before burning it. The Book of the Later Han records that Dong Zhuo's forces disinterred imperial tombs to steal burial goods, melted down bronze statues to mint currency, and executed thousands of officials on fabricated charges. Fanye's chronicle lists specific executions. Minister Yuan Wei beheaded for opposing the capital's relocation. General Ding Yuan assassinated for questioning military orders. Dozens of court officials buried alive for alleged conspiracies. Here's what makes Dong Zhuo's erasure from Chinese historical memory so complete. Within 2 years of his assassination, in 192 Common Era, his name had become synonymous with tyrannical excess in Chinese literature. But unlike other vilified rulers who retained some historical acknowledgement of their achievements, Dong Zhuo was systematically written out of the imperial genealogy. Professor Patricia Ebry of University of Washington, in her 2006 study, Cambridge Illustrated History of China, notes that later Han historians refused to grant Dong Zhuo the title of emperor despite his de facto control over the throne. He exists in the historical record as a usurper, never as a legitimate ruler. The mainstream historical explanation treats Dong Zhuo as a regional warlord who exploited the weakness following Emperor Ling's death to seize temporary control of the imperial court. Traditional Chinese historiography, following Confucian principles, categorizes him as a rebel against legitimate authority rather than a ruler in his own right. The consensus view holds that his brief period of control represented a breakdown of proper imperial succession, not an actual dynasty. His assassination by his own adopted son, Lu Bu, is presented as the restoration of proper order rather than regicide. But the thoroughness of Dong Zhuo's cultural erasure suggests something more deliberate than simple moral condemnation. Contemporary records indicate that his control over the imperial apparatus was absolute for nearly 3 years. He appointed ministers, issued imperial edicts, commanded the imperial army, and controlled the imperial treasury. Every function of imperial power operated under his authority. Yet later, historians consistently refuse to acknowledge this reality. Professor Charles Holcomb of University of Northern Iowa, in his 2017 work, A History of East Asia, argues that the systematic denial of Dong Zhuo's imperial status reflects a later effort to maintain the fiction of unbroken Han legitimacy. The alternative, acknowledging that a frontier general successfully conquered the Chinese Empire, would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of imperial succession. The physical evidence supports this interpretation. Archaeological excavations at Luoyang, conducted by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences between 1958 and 1985, revealed extensive fire damage, dating to precisely 190 Common Era. The burn layers contain artifacts consistent with systematic looting and destruction, not random warfare. Site director Wang Zhongshu documented that the Imperial Library complex was deliberately targeted, with bronze fittings stripped from wooden shelving before the buildings were burned. This suggests organized destruction rather than collateral damage from urban fighting. Even Dong Zhuo's physical elimination was unusually complete. After Lu Bu's assassination, contemporary accounts describe how Dong Zhuo's corpse was mutilated, his family executed, and his estates confiscated. His body was reportedly left to rot in the streets of Chang'an for days before being burned. The Book of the Later Han records that citizens used his corpse fat to fuel lamps, a detail so specific it suggests eyewitness reporting rather than literary embellishment. Was Dong Zhuo's cultural erasure the price of maintaining imperial legitimacy? Did later historians systematically deny his imperial status to preserve the fiction of unbroken dynastic succession? How does a man who controlled the Chinese Empire for 3 years become a non-person in Chinese historical memory? What other inconvenient rulers have been written out of the official record? Can historical truth survive ideological necessity? Yet Dong Zhuo's legacy would pale beside the systematic cruelty of rulers who didn't even require erasure to terrify their subjects into silence. Caracalla. You stand in the grand audience hall of the Domus Transitoria in Rome, 212 Common Era. The morning light streams through tall windows, illuminating frescoes that stretch across marble walls. Imperial portraits line the corridors in perfect succession, but something is wrong. Gaps appear where faces should be. Blank spaces interrupt ceremonial scenes. Ghostly silhouettes mark where figures once stood beside the emperor. The artist's chisels have carved away entire sections of stone, leaving smooth voids that seem to watch you with absent eyes. Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus, known to history as Caracalla, had ordered the systematic erasure of his younger brother Publius Septimius Geta from the visual record of the Roman Empire. After murdering Geta in their mother's arms in February of 212, Caracalla issued what scholars call the damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Every coin, every fresco, every statue, every inscription bearing Geta's image or name was to be destroyed or defaced throughout the known world. The scale of this erasure operation, documented by contemporary historian Cassius Dio in his Roman History and later analyzed by archaeologist Mary Beard in her 2015 study, The Roman Triumph, represents one of history's most comprehensive attempts to delete a human being from existence. Caracalla deployed teams of craftsmen, soldiers, and administrators across an empire, spanning 3 million square miles to hunt down and obliterate every trace of his brother's 23 years of life. Here's what makes this erasure campaign unprecedented in its thoroughness. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Mediterranean reveals the surgical precision with which Geta's image was removed. At Leptis Magna in Libya, the Severan Basilica contains a relief showing the imperial family making sacrifices, except one figure has been chiseled away so carefully that the remaining figure's poses still make perfect compositional sense. In the British Museum, coins from the Joint Reign show identical hammer marks, where Geta's profile was systematically obliterated. At the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, infrared photography, revealed by University of Oxford archaeologist Roger Wilson in his 2008 excavation report, shows ghostly outlines where Geta's portraits once adorned the walls. The mainstream historical explanation treats this as political necessity. Caracalla had murdered his co-emperor brother to consolidate power, and the damnatio memoriae served to legitimize the fratricide by erasing evidence of Geta's rightful claim to rule. Roman emperors regularly employed memory sanctions against fallen rivals, and Caracalla's campaign, while extreme in scope, followed established imperial precedent for dealing with threats to dynastic succession. But the archaeological record reveals something more disturbing than mere political calculation. The erasure wasn't limited to official state imagery. Private homes in Pompeii contained frescoes where Geta's face was scratched away by residents who had no political reason to comply. Funeral monuments in distant provinces show similar defacement. Graffiti supporting Geta was chiseled off walls in Egyptian temples. This suggests either an enforcement apparatus so thorough it reached into every corner of private life, or a population so terrified of Caracalla that they preemptively erased memories of his brother from their own homes. The speed of the operation raises additional questions that historians struggle to answer. Cassius Dio records that the erasure began immediately after Geta's murder and was substantially complete within 18 months across the entire Mediterranean world. In an era when messages traveled at the speed of horses and ships, coordinating such a comprehensive campaign would have required unprecedented administrative efficiency. Some researchers suggest that Caracalla had planned the erasure infrastructure before committing the murder, implying premeditation that went beyond a moment of fraternal rage. The psychological impact on the Roman population may have been as calculated as the physical erasure. Citizens found themselves surrounded by absent presences, gaps in familiar images that reminded them daily of imperial power's ability to unmake reality itself. The empty spaces spoke louder than any propaganda about what happened to those who crossed the emperor. Contemporary accounts describe Romans becoming reluctant to speak Geta's name aloud, even in private, as if the very sound might summon imperial attention. What drove an emperor to attempt something so psychologically sophisticated as erasing reality itself? Did Caracalla understand that the gaps would be more terrifying than any replacement imagery? How did ordinary Romans interpret these sudden absences appearing everywhere they looked? Can power truly delete a human being from history when the very act of deletion leaves its own evidence? Why did the Roman people participate in erasing someone they had no reason to hate? But Caracalla's systematic erasure of his brother would seem almost restrained compared to what awaited Persia in the 18th century. Nadir Shah, you stand in the rubble of what was once the greatest city in the world. The year is 1739, Delhi, the air thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Bodies fill every street, every courtyard, every doorway. 100,000 souls silenced in a single day. The peacock throne, worth more than the entire treasury of France, sits loaded onto Persian carts. You watch as the conqueror who ordered this slaughter walks among the carnage he has created, his own officers turning their faces away in disgust. The man responsible for this devastation was Nadir Shah Afshar, documented extensively in the chronicles of his court historian Mirza Mahdi Khan Astarabadi, whose times Tariq-i Jahangusha-i Nadiri times remains the primary source for understanding the Persian conqueror's 11-year reign. Born around 1688, Nadir rose from tribal warrior to Shah of Persia by 1736, establishing the Afsharid dynasty through a combination of military genius and unprecedented brutality. British East India Company records, preserved in the India Office collection, document his 1739 invasion of Mughal India with mathematical precision. The siege of Delhi lasted exactly 57 days. The subsequent massacre, ordered after a minor rebellion against Persian tax collectors, claimed the lives of 100,000 civilians in less than 24 hours, according to multiple contemporary sources, including the Persian chronicler Abdul Karim Kashmiri. Dr. Michael Axworthy of the University of Exeter, in his 2006 work Times, The Sword of Persia, Nadir Shah, From Tribal Warrior to Conquering Tyrant, calculated that Nadir's Delhi campaign netted treasure equivalent to 700 million pounds sterling in modern currency. The wealth extraction was so complete that the Mughal Empire never recovered its former power. Persian records show Nadir's forces stripped not just the imperial treasury, but systematically looted every wealthy household, mosque, and market in the city. Here's what makes Nadir Shah's erasure from history remarkable. Despite conquering territories from the Ottoman Empire to northern India, despite commanding armies that defeated every major power of his era, his reign ended in 1747, when his own nobles assassinated him. The assassination wasn't driven by military defeat or external pressure. Court records from the Persian National Archives reveal a conspiracy led by his own nephew, Ali Koli, motivated specifically by Nadir's increasing savagery toward his own people. The mainstream historical explanation positions Nadir Shah as a brilliant military strategist whose later paranoia and cruelty led to inevitable downfall. Standard Persian historiography, exemplified in the works of Professor Lawrence Lockhart's times, Nadir Shah, A Critical Study, argues that his assassination was the natural result of alienating his power base through excessive violence and suspicion. The narrative follows a familiar pattern of autocratic overreach leading to palace coup, but the evidence suggests something far more systematic occurred. Immediately following Nadir's assassination, his empire didn't simply fragment, it was actively dismantled by coordinated effort. The Afsharid dynasty, which could have continued under his sons or generals, was completely extinguished within months. Persian court records show his closest advisors, rather than fighting for succession, collaborated in destroying administrative documents and dispersing the army. Even more telling, later Persian historians working under the Zand and Qajar dynasties received explicit instructions to minimize Nadir's achievements in official chronicles. Archaeological evidence from Kaladi Nadiri, Nadir's fortress capital in Khorasan, reveals systematic destruction that occurred immediately after his death. Professor Abbas Daneshvari's 1995 excavation of the site, published in Times Iranian Studies, uncovered evidence that the palace complex was methodically demolished, with particular attention paid to destroying inscriptions and relief carvings celebrating Nadir's conquests. This wasn't random looting or gradual decay, it was deliberate historical erasure. The most disturbing aspect of this erasure becomes clear in diplomatic correspondence preserved in the British Library's Persian manuscripts collection. Letters between regional governors written in the months following Nadir's death reveal coordinated efforts to remove his name from official documents, replace his portraits in public buildings, and cease all commemorative activities. One particularly revealing letter from the governor of Isfahan states explicitly that the memory of the tyrant must be wiped clean so that future generations might not follow his example. Some researchers suggest that Nadir Shah's brutality crossed a threshold that even 18th century Persian society found unacceptable. His treatment of civilians, documented in harrowing detail by Mughal chroniclers, included innovations in mass execution and psychological warfare that horrified his contemporaries. The systematic nature of the historical erasure that followed suggests a collective trauma so profound that an entire civilization chose amnesia over remembrance. What drove a ruler's own people to systematically erase his existence from official memory? How brutal must a conqueror be for his greatest victories to become sources of shame rather than pride? Can the deliberate destruction of historical records ever truly erase the impact of atrocity? Why do some tyrants become legendary while others vanish entirely from collective memory? Even as Nadir's Persian Empire crumbled under the weight of its own revulsion, across the world, another ruler would soon face his subjects' ultimate judgment for crimes that defied all precedent. Phocas. The marble refuses to hold the chisel. You're standing in the imperial workshop beneath the great palace of Constantinople, watching craftsmen attempt something unprecedented in Byzantine history. The year is 611 of the Common Era. Every blow of their hammers seems to echo through the vaulted chambers like thunder. They're not creating, they're destroying. Methodically, deliberately. The face of Phocas, carved into monuments across the empire, stamped into thousands of coins, painted onto church walls, is being systematically erased. Not just removed, obliterated, as if he had never existed at all. The documented evidence of this imperial damnatio memoriae comes from multiple Byzantine chroniclers, most notably John of Antioch and the Chronicon Paschale, both writing within decades of Phocas's death. Professor Warren Treadgold of St. Louis University, in his definitive work, A History of the Byzantine State and Society, published in 1997, catalogs over 300 surviving coins from Phocas's 8-year reign that show clear evidence of deliberate defacement. The faces have been carefully hammered flat, the inscriptions chiseled away with surgical precision. Archaeological surveys conducted by the Austrian Archaeological Institute between 2000 and 2006 documented similar treatment of his image across 17 different sites, from Constantinople to Ravenna. But the physical erasure was just the beginning. The historical record reveals something far more systematic. Contemporary sources describe Phocas as a centurion who seized power through the military revolt that overthrew Emperor Maurice in 602. What makes his reign extraordinary is not just its brutality, but the calculated nature of that brutality. The chronicler, Theophylact Simocatta, writing around 630, documents specific torture methods employed by Phocas's regime. The systematic maiming of aristocratic families, the burning of entire neighborhoods in Constantinople suspected of disloyalty, the execution of senators who were forced to watch their sons die first. Michael Whitby, professor of classics and ancient history at the University of Warwick, notes in his 2008 analysis of Byzantine imperial violence that Phocas represents something unique in the empire's history. This wasn't the random cruelty of a mad emperor, but what Whitby terms administrative terrorism, violence as state policy, designed to paralyze potential opposition through fear. Here's what makes Phocas impossible to dismiss as simply another brutal ruler: the scale and precision of the erasure that followed his death. When Heraclius overthrew him in 610, the new emperor didn't just execute Phocas. He ordered what Byzantine scholars call the most complete damnatio memoriae in the empire's 1,000-year history. Every trace of Phocas's existence was to be removed from official record. His laws were rescinded, His appointments were voided retroactively. His name was chiseled out of inscriptions with such thoroughness that modern historians didn't even know his full name until the 20th century. The mainstream historical explanation presents this as standard imperial practice following the overthrow of an unpopular usurper. Damnatio memoriae was an established Roman tradition, inherited by Byzantium, designed to delegitimize illegitimate rulers and restore stability. Heraclius, facing massive military pressures from Persia and internal rebellion, needed to distance his regime completely from his predecessor's failures. The systematic destruction of Phocas's image and record served clear political purposes, legitimizing the new dynasty and providing a visible symbol of regime change. But the Byzantine sources reveal something that goes beyond standard political necessity. The chronicler George of Pisidia, writing as Heraclius's court poet, describes the destruction of Phocas's images in language typically reserved for the defeat of demons. Church records from Constantinople describe public ceremonies where citizens were encouraged to participate in defacing Phocas's portraits. This wasn't just official policy, it became popular obsession. Archaeological evidence suggests that even private citizens destroyed Phocas-era coins in their possession, something virtually unprecedented in a culture where imperial currency held sacred significance. Some researchers suggest that Phocas's reign represented a kind of social breakdown that went beyond normal imperial violence. Dr. Avril Cameron of Oxford University, in her 2006 work on Byzantine imperial ideology, argues that Phocas's systematic torture of the aristocracy created what she terms participatory trauma, entire social classes bound together by shared suffering. The subsequent erasure wasn't just political calculation, but psychological necessity. The empire needed to forget not just Phocas, but the version of itself that had allowed him to exist. The physical evidence supports this interpretation. When archaeologists study the defaced coins and monuments, they find something unusual. Many show multiple episodes of destruction spread across several years. Citizens weren't just obeying imperial orders in 610. They were continuing to destroy traces of Phocas throughout Heraclius's early reign, as if his memory kept trying to resurface and had to be beaten back down repeatedly. Why does an empire need to forget its own emperor so completely that even his name disappears from official records? What kind of trauma requires not just punishment, but erasure? Can systematic brutality become so normalized that only forgetting can break the cycle? Who else might we have lost to this same desperate need to forget? These 10 rulers, scattered across millennia and continents, share something more than cruelty. They represent moments when civilizations chose amnesia over memory, silence over testimony. These 10 rulers shared something more terrifying than their cruelty. They revealed the uncomfortable truth about power itself. Each one discovered that absolute authority dissolves the very foundations it claims to protect. Akhenaten's divine revolution, Gaoyang's systematic paranoia, Herostratus' manufactured immortality, they all stumbled upon the same paradox. The more completely they wielded power, the more completely it consumed not just their victims, but the very memory of their existence. What emerges from these erasures is not justice, but something far more unsettling. These weren't isolated monsters who appeared from nowhere. They were products of the same systems that eventually destroyed them. The Roman Senate that elevated Commodus also orchestrated his assassination. The Chinese court that empowered Dong Zhuo provided the daggers that ended him. The Persian nobles who crowned Nadir Shah wrote the chronicles that would damn him. Each society created its own destroyer, then spent generations scrubbing away the evidence of what it had done. The real horror isn't that such rulers existed, it's how efficiently they were disappeared. How quickly entire civilizations learned to perform collective amnesia. How seamlessly the machinery of power rolled forward, as if these men had never drawn breath. Their erasure wasn't punishment, it was maintenance. A kind of historical immune response that eliminated threats not to justice, but to the illusion that power could be trusted with itself. 10 men who held absolute authority over millions of lives, reduced to footnotes and fragments. 10 reminders that the most dangerous truth about power is how easily it can make even itself disappear. What other inconvenient realities have been scrubbed from the record? What other impossibilities are we still choosing not to see?